were almost completed, the Jews from Asia, seeing him in the temple, stirred up the whole crowd and laid hands on him. Now this isn't holy hands. This is like they mobbed up and they like grabbed him and were getting ready to beat him. And it says in verse 28, they're crying out, "Men of Israel, help. This is the man who is teaching everyone everywhere against the people and the law in this place. Moreover, he even brought Greeks into the temple and has defiled this holy place." And then it says in verse 29, "For they had previously seen Trophimus the Ephesian with him in the city, and they supposed that Paul had brought him into the temple." See, these Jews from Asia see Paul coming out of the temple. If you remember, Pastor Weston covered it last week. They went through this 7-day purification process, and they see Paul coming out of the temple, and they lose their mind. They stir everyone up. They get a crowd, get a mob together, and they grab Paul and start crying out, "This is the man who has been teaching everyone everywhere against our temple and has even brought other people into the temple and defiled everything that we're doing." And it says that they saw him and they supposed that Paul had brought this man, Trophimus, into the temple. And that being said, I want to list that people will always assume. People will always assume. It's a reality that if you meet someone that you've already heard about, then you have preconceived notions about that person. And that first impression can either accept, they can either validate your preconceived notions, or they can invalidate them. And in this case, Paul didn't really get a chance to set these preconceived notions about him that were negative, that went against a lot of the things that he was actually doing. He didn't have a chance to kind of help his reputation with these people because they had already heard about who Paul was. The fact of the matter is that most people will have preconceived notions about you, about your faith, about things that they've heard about you and your faith. And a lot of times, these preconceived notions aren't fully accurate because they're coming from secondary sources. They're coming from people who might know you or people who heard it from other people. So usually it's just this chain of ideas about you, and you come in contact with those people, and now you have the opportunity to either validate or invalidate their notions. People will always assume. Paul actually did what he could before this passage. If you remember from last week, Paul actually did everything that he could to change this reputation that he had started. He went through this 7-day purification process that I don't even know if he really agreed with in the first place, but it seemed like he was just really appeasing people. And the point of it was, by the people who told him to do it, they said the point of that is so that he would be more accepted among the Jews of that area. He did what he could to change this reputation. And we need to be doing everything we can to make a reputation that honors us and honors God and honors the things that we're called to do. Because if our reputation doesn't match with what we believe, a lot of times people won't care to hear what we have to say. And we can't always, we can't control that reputation that we set, but we can sure do whatever we can to try to make that reputation be a positive one. So Paul did everything he could, and unfortunately it didn't change what people thought about him. It didn't change the preconceived notions that people had, so they mob him, and they walk up and grab him and call out all those things and say that he defiled the temple. In verse 30 it says, "Then all the city was stirred up, and the people ran together. They seized Paul and dragged him out of the temple, and at once the gates were shut. And as they were seeking to kill him, word came to the tribune of the cohort that all Jerusalem was in confusion." See, this tribune of the cohort is basically this elected official above the Jerusalem military. So this tribune hears all about what's going on in this city, and actually the Jewish people who had just accused Paul begin to beat him. I wanted to hit on this thing that we actually talked about a few weeks. This is the promise of persecution. It's right there. It's the promise of persecution. I mean, a prophet came to Paul a few weeks ago and said, hey, he took his belt and he said, you will be arrested and you will be persecuted. And then in John, I actually have this verse listed. In John 15:20, it says, since they persecuted me, they will naturally persecute you. It's this promise of persecution. As a believer, you will be persecuted. As a follower of Jesus, it says, since they persecuted me, Jesus said it, they will inevitably, naturally persecute you. It's a promise of persecution. In verse 32, he at once took soldiers and centurions and ran down to them, and then they saw the tribune and the soldiers stop beating Paul. So all of a sudden, the Jews see these tribunes and all of these soldiers, and they stop beating Paul. They say, oh, hold up. We'll let them handle it. We won't take it into our own hands anymore. And then it says the tribune came up and arrested Paul and ordered him to be bound with 2 chains. If you remember, that prophet took the belt and bound his hands and his feet, bound with 2 chains, and he inquired who he was and what he had done. So the tribune wanted to know. He just heard about the city being in shambles and division. He wanted to know who Paul was and what he had done. What made the city do all this to him? And then it says in verse 34, some in the crowd were shouting one thing, some another. And as he could not learn the facts because of the uproar, he ordered them to be brought into the barracks. And when he came to the steps, he was actually carried by the soldiers because of the violence of the crowd. And then in verse 38, for the mob of people followed, crying, away from him, away from him. So we see this tribune wants to get these answers and is trying to figure out what to do. But in the midst of the chaos, in the midst of the crying out and the emotion, he couldn't obtain the answer that he needed. And I wrote this down. This is because chaos hinders communication. Chaos hinders communication. In whatever situation you're in, when there's chaos and there's emotion and there's yelling and there's screaming matches and there's arguments and there's a lot of people just getting worked up, that hinders communication. That hinders you from reaching a point where you can just have a conversation. It's hard to communicate in the midst of a crowd. That's why we have meetings. That's why we meet with people one-on-one, sometimes two-on-two, because we don't want a whole crowd. We don't have meetings in the sanctuary every Sunday and let everybody know everybody's business and try, because communication can't happen. And that's where preconceived notions and rumors happen, in the midst of people just being emotional and crying out. Crowds and chaos hinder communication. But hear me, they take Paul away from the crowd, away from the chaos. They take him out of the emotion and out of the crying out, and they take him to a place where it's a little more calm. And you know why? Because calmness promotes conversation. While chaos hinders communication, calmness will promote conversation. When you're able to step back from a situation, especially as believers, when we're able to step back and not be like the world and not be causing the chaos, but be the peacemakers that we're called to be, when we're able to step back from the crowd and step back from the chaos, a lot of times conversation is able to happen, and then the final part, resolution, is found. It happens in calmness. We resolve problems most of the time. If you look at the arguments that you've been in and the disagreements that you've gone through, and possibly even for some of us who are guilty of the screaming matches that have to happen, if you look back at those situations, the resolution didn't happen in the midst of that screaming match. The resolution happened when everything calmed down, all the emotion was kind of gone away. You might have went to bed, or might have took a nap, or might have had to take a step back from whatever the situation is, and then you join again in the midst of calmness, in the midst of everybody just kind of setting their emotions aside. And a lot of times that's where the resolution happens. Resolution doesn't happen in the midst of a crowd. Resolution doesn't happen in the midst of chaos. It happens in the midst of calmness. And I believe that's a principle that Paul had to learn, that this tribune had to learn. It's a principle that I believe God laid out in this passage, is that when we're in the midst of a disagreement and we're in the midst of everyone around us freaking out, we're called to be those who are calm. We're called to be those who don't let a situation cause any more confusion, don't let a situation cause any more lack of conversation, but we're called to be the peacemakers, the one who makes things calm and then decide to have a conversation. So yeah, let's bow our heads and pray. Lord, we love you. God, we thank you for your word, and we thank you for everything that you've spoken to us through your word. Father, I pray that you would help us to be the peacemakers. Lord, help us to be those who are calm. Help us to realize that in the midst of chaos, in the midst of a crowd, in the midst of screaming matches, Lord,